Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. It's great to be with all of you, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we're talking about the Israeli political situation, of course, with a lot of changes that have taken place over the last week. And there is the decision just by earlier today by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to disband the war cabinet and to stop the convening of the cabinet that had until now been managing the war. This is a result, obviously, of Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot's departure from the emergency war government that was established shortly after the October 7th Hamas massacre. But with all that's happening, it seems to some extent, and there have been tragedies on the ground, just 11 soldiers who were buried over the last 24, 48 hours here in Israel, funeral after funeral, and stories of amazing young men, and some not even that young. A 49-year-old father of a number of children, a grandfather who was killed, who was killed fighting on behalf of Israel in Gaza. And lots of questions of why does a 49-year-old person, a father of 5 children, 6 children, of a grandfather even need to be in Gaza? Well, we have a problem when it comes to soldiers, right? And we have a problem when we have a large portion of Israel that continues to dig in its heels and refuse to serve in the IDF. As we know, the standoff right now in the government and in the Knesset regarding everything that has to do with the draft bill. And then, of course, is the situation in the north. Is Israel potentially going to another war on a second front, this time with Hezbollah, which has been increasing its rocket attacks against Israel? Israel, of course, retaliating earlier today, another targeted strike against a Hezbollah operative in southern Lebanon. Everything that's done by Hezbollah attacks against Israel and Israeli counterattacks against Hezbollah in Lebanon all potentially lead to one place, and that is a wider conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, one that would be devastating, I think, for Israel, but also even more devastating for the country and the people of Lebanon. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm joined this evening by Shmuel Rosner, a senior fellow at JPPI, and Professor Michal Siegal, also a senior fellow at JPPI and a vice president at Ben-Gurion University. And later in the show, we'll have an interview with Aryeh Myers, who is a senior paramedic and an international relations liaison for Magen Adom for MADA, which is the national EMS service here in Israel. And I spoke with Aryeh, who I've gotten to know over the last few months, not only to tell us a bit about what Magen Adom has done since the war broke out last October, but also how Israeli emergency services are preparing for the prospect and for the possibility of even a wider conflict. So I hate to say this and to start off with such like an ominous mood and gloom and doom in today's show, but that's where my mind is, and that's kind of where I am at the moment, personally. So not overly optimistic to people who are watching us right now. But Shmuel, why don't I start with you? And let's first take apart for a moment the whole tension with Lebanon and obviously what's happening there. And I mean, give me, if you can, your take on where do you think, because I hear a lot of people, right? There's a lot of criticism, for example, that Netanyahu is not deciding, right? He's hesitating. He doesn't know what to do. And I kind of look at it a little differently, that he actually has made a decision. And his decision is to try to contain the situation in the north. And by the way, as we're speaking, Amos Hochstein, senior advisor and aide to President Biden, is here, met just earlier today with President Herzog, is meeting with the prime minister, going to meet with the defense minister. So there's a lot to talk about in the American ongoing efforts to try to prevent a wider escalation. So where do you see the prime minister and this government that now lacks the more moderate wing that it had up until just about a week ago?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. The prime minister did make a decision. He made it early on in the war when his defense minister urged him to launch an attack on Lebanon right after Hezbollah started firing rockets at Israel. And Netanyahu, under some pressure from the American administration, decided that expanding the war was not a good idea for Israel. He decided to focus on Gaza, to focus on the south, and to absorb the heat that Israel is getting from the north. It's a very difficult decision. It's difficult both strategically and politically. It doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good. The whole notion of deterrence against Lebanon is looking quite, our deterrence looks quite weak at the moment. Hezbollah basically shoots rockets almost daily on military installations, on towns and kibbutzim and moshavim in the north. Many evacuees from the northern part of Israel cannot return home, and when they eventually return home, and one hopes that they will eventually return, they don't have much to return to. There will have to be a rebuild of the whole region. So Netanyahu, for better or worse, deserves some credit for his decision to contain this area, to contain this conflict, knowing that focusing on the south is currently the priority of Israel, knowing that he does not have the backing of the United States for going to war in the north. But ultimately, and this we know well from Israel's history, one miscalculation in the north can put the whole area, can erupt in flames. If Hezbollah, without intention, hits something that it did not intend to hit, or there are too many people killed on the Israeli side or the Lebanese side, one incident can lead us to war, even though at the current moment it seems as if no one wants this to be expanded to a larger war.
Michal, I'm curious, when we think about this, JPPI did a poll just a few days ago showing that a third of Israelis are in favor right now at attacking Lebanon immediately, or attacking Hezbollah immediately, not even waiting. And you could say a third, it's not a majority, but that's a significant portion of Israel's population, especially at a time that we're still at a war down south that is yet to conclude. And we'll talk in a moment about how will it even conclude, because that is beginning to look very slippery in of itself. But where do you see the Israeli mood, and where are the Israeli people 9 months almost into this conflict? The prospect, do we fully appreciate what a war with Hezbollah will look like? That what it would mean for us, forget about even international relations, just internally inside Israel?
First, I agree. We don't know. And I think the support we have for, can you hear me?
Yes.
The support we have for such an action doesn't mean that the people know what they're supporting, right? I don't know what the percentage is on people who support the continuation of the war in Gaza, but I think it's a little bit similar to that. But even bigger unknown. But it does signal something about what we feel about the current situation. I think Shmuel is right. There was a decision made to not decide, and not deciding has ramification, and we got to this stage. And I want to tell two stories about what the situation in the north meant to me personally. But first of all, I think before we talk about how horrible things in the north is, there's something that I want to support Shmuel in. Not that doesn't always happen, but this case I agree with him. I think the fact that Hezbollah can shoot further into the heartland of Israel and doesn't. It creates horrible damage to everything that happens in the north, but the fact that it doesn't escalate shows that there is, on their side as well, a willingness to stop, at a certain level of escalation. And obviously, we kill on the other side and we hit on the other side, but there is we can see evidence of the fact that it is contained on a certain level, but obviously can erupt at any second, and we don't know what it means. But honestly, now I'm going to turn, I think, a little bit more militant in my view. I think the decision not to decide has prices that are unthinkable. I want to tell two stories. First of all, I have a student of mine, Rafael Kaudos, who wrote his master's in our program at Jewish Thought at Ben Gurion University. He was my student, wrote a few seminar papers with me, and I admired him, and he was one of those students that you want to have in your class. And he died on June 5th in the north. He was actually doing his military service, his miluim, as a ktzin dat. I don't know how to translate it. A religious
affairs officer or something.
Officer tending to people in the north. By the way, I have other friends of mine who passed in their car 10 minutes before they're in the same spot that he was killed by one of those missiles that came in, and it's heartbreaking. He wasn't even a militant or combatant. He was just there in the north tending to the religious needs of soldiers and people in the north. And obviously such an incredible waste of this is unthinkable. And the second thing I want to say, I have a very good friend whose sister lives in the north, and she lives in one of those yeshuvim that wasn't declared worthy of moving it and dislocating its people. It's not far enough or whatever. And they moved on their own for 6 months. At some point, then the money ran out. They came back to a moshav in the north, and they're telling of a Siegal, of a daily life where they have like a 7-year-old who gets dropped off by his bus, the school bus, drops him off in the beginning of the moshav, and they walk into their house on the moshav. And the kid is 7-year-old, and there is a rocket attack, and he hides himself on the way home on his own, a 7-year-old, and this is their daily life, and that's not a rare occurrence. And this is in Israel proper. This is the north. We are in a situation where honestly the decision not to decide and keep things the way they are is just unthinkable. And this is we kind of sign a contract with the citizen of Israel that this on the land of Israel, we've lost entire territories and areas in Israel, and this is unthinkable. Something needs to be done. By the way, we haven't said the one magic word that could, it's not a confrontation or not confrontation or containing or confrontation. There's a third option, which is, a peace treaty of some kind with the North. I don't know, we don't even know, we can't even trust our government to know that they've explored that possibility all the way. I don't know, if the other side will be willing, if we'll be willing to sign that, but this is not something that's been discussed enough. And obviously signing this would mean to admit that we're, we've lost on certain elements, but I don't know, this daily life that I'm describing means that we've been losing for a while. And that needs to be acknowledged in some way. And maybe, peaceful solution is not the best possibility, but at least some kind of a solution to this horrible, horrible situation we're at.
I'll just add, I think what a lot of people tend to forget about the situation in the north specifically is that one of Israel's doctrines from a defense perspective has long been that all wars need to be fought in enemy territory. It was for a very simple reason. And I think it was already in the period of David Ben-Gurion, in the beginning of the country, there were basically two doctrines. One was wars have to be short. Israel cannot sustain long conflicts, and we're seeing what happens when these wars drag on. But number two is that they always have to be taken to the other side because we have no depth, no strategic depth. And everyone saw that, by the way, on October 7, when Hamas crossed in, immediately after breaching the border, they were inside our homes, right? They were inside our bases. There's no, oh, they crossed in, now I have, 5 hours till they get to the first residential area. No, it's right there. So what we saw in the north was Israel basically, and I think you said this correctly, Michal, Israel basically saying, well, we're going to create a buffer zone, but we're going to create it inside Israel. So we're ceding territory to our enemy. If in the past, after the 1982 Israeli offensive in Lebanon, up until 2000, we kept the security zone in southern Lebanon. And we could argue whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing, but it does show something that when the security zone is inside Israel, as opposed to inside Lebanon, it tells you what Israel's concerns are. We don't want to have to go back into Lebanon. We don't want to have that security zone at the moment. And I think that is, at the moment, I'll go even as far as to say we're losing that war. I mean, the fact that we have ceded that territory so far, we're losing. Can we win? It's possible, maybe with some sort of peaceful diplomatic resolution, but also it might have to require a wider conflict. And I'll go back to you, Shmuel, for a moment. Because now that Gantz and Eisenkot are out of the government, not that I was the biggest Gantz Eisenkot fan, but put aside my personal opinions for a moment. I mean, this government that's left, and I chuckle, it's not exactly the one that mainstream Israel, feels safe and secure with, right? And Gantz decided to leave the government for his political reasons, and he gave a series of interviews over the weekend where he basically explained why he did that. Gadi Eisenkot has also spoken to the media, and basically Netanyahu was holding things up, things weren't moving, he was fooling everyone, etc. That's what they're saying. But now we're left with a security cabinet that has, Likud, Ben Gvir and his party, and Bezalel Smotrich and his party. And besides, forget about it for a moment what the Americans and Europeans might think about that. I don't think Israelis are feeling that safe and secure with that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, you're not wrong, but we must remind ourselves that this is the government that Israelis elected a year and a half ago. It's not an illegal government. It's not some government that accidentally was put in place. This was the choice of Israelis a year and a half ago. Do they regret their choice? If you look at the public opinion polls, they seem to regret the choice. The approval rating for the prime minister hovers slightly above 30%. The approval rating of the government is even lower. So Israelis aren't pleased with the government. But right now, that is the government that they have. And as long as it retains its majority in the parliament, in the Knesset, there's no way for Israelis to have a different government. I agree with you. It's not a healthy situation for a country to be at war with a government that the people do not trust. It's a government in which many members did not even serve in the military. It's Likud, it's Tzionut Datit and Otzma Yehudit, and the two ultra-religious parties, Shas and Yahadut HaTorah. These parties are currently fighting to extend the exemption for young Haredi boys from going into military service. So you have a government that on the one hand demands that young secular or religious Israelis will go and risk their lives and oftentimes pay with their lives for Israel. And on the other hand, the same government is moving forward with legislation that aims to exempt a large chunk of young Israeli population from serving in the military. It's not a healthy situation. I don't think it's a sustainable situation for much longer. But right now, it is what we have, and we have to live with it on a day-by-day basis.
Or as we say in Hebrew, this is what we have, and with this we will win. No, Michal, you don't like that.
No, we're not winning, we're losing. And it's not, it is what it is, but it does touches on something that I've been thinking a lot and bothers me a lot. If you disagree with the current government and you want to influence its action, how do you do it? What's the best way to do it? There's been a movement counter this government's policy for a while now, and it's been in the streets in an unprecedented way around the world. And it hasn't influenced the governments. It has influence on certain levels, and the judicial coup, there was some, local wins. But how do you lead from that to a change in a government, in a solid government of 64, members? How do you change it? Because no, we're not, this is what we have and this is how we'll win. This is what we have and we're losing. And it's awful. And the price is incredible. We haven't even begun to talk about deterrence and Harta'ah and what it will do to our future safety in this region. Can't believe, Yaakov, that today I'm presenting a more militant view, but we have to take that into account.
It happens to all of us.
It does, but I'm very worried. We're surrounded by enemies that wish us harm in a very serious way, and they have the capability in harming us horribly. What does this containment for 8 months do? What does it mean? The views, seeing the north burn like that, people's houses destroyed, people's lives taken. How do you change the reality of a government that's been, I can't live with this statement you just said, Shmuel, that, this is what it is. We'll have to live with it for 4 years.
I understand what you're saying, but you do have to admit that the protest movement is not as large as it used to be. Before the war, during the judicial reform, the numbers were such that the government had to take them into account. And in fact, the judicial reform did not pass in its original form.
So hold on. So wait, Shmuel, because I wait 1 second. One second.
Wait, but Yaakov, I disagree.
No, okay. Well, I'll get to that, but I didn't want to ask you about that, Shmuel, because that was what I was going to ask you. Why are people not in the streets? Why is it that the government passes a shameful? It's only the first reading of this draft bill, that basically keeps the situation as it is at a time that the IDF is missing thousands of soldiers that it needs, not just because of soldiers who have been killed or wounded and now taken out of combat, but because of the change of the reality that will require greater force deployment along the different fronts that we now face in the South and in the North. Why am I not seeing 500,000 people on the streets every single day saying what Michal is saying? We need to change either the government, call for elections, or at least pass a law that will change reality here. Why are people not doing that?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons for that. It's an interesting question. I think one of the reasons is that people aren't yet certain what the protest is about. There is a mixture of different messages carried by different groups of protesters, and it's not always clear if the protest is for the hostages or against the government or against the war or for something else. And some people don't feel comfortable to go and protest against something when they aren't sure what this something is. The other reason is that people don't feel comfortable protesting against their own government in a time of war. Israel is at war.
But Shmuel, that gives you the answer of why this has changed from before the war to now, and why it's not a testimony to the sentiment of the people at home, right?
No, the people want the government replaced. There's no question about that. But the government is not going to dismantle itself, and for it to take into consideration the protest movement, you'll have to see more people in the streets. They will not be considerate of 20,000 or 50,000 people. If there's 500,000 people or 1 million people in the streets, that will be a different situation.
I'm not even sure that this is right. I have to say, I'm not sure that this is right, because you assume that the numbers make a difference. They make a difference. I think I'm not sure it makes a difference to this specific governments, but it basically, by the way, I don't know if you know, but the judicial coup is continuing to happen, but a much lower, volume underneath the surface. They learned to change their methods in doing so. I think it's still very much out there, and it still might very well happen. But I actually think that even if we have very large numbers, the numbers matter for a different reason. They matter for the world outside. Because when Israel gets attacked on courts, and I deal with, an academic arena, but in other arenas as well, it matters for us to say, listen, look at how many people, are against the policy, the current government's policy. So it's important for that and that alone, in addition to other benefits, such as feeling as part of a movement. I know myself that when I go to such a thing, and I go and support the families of the kidnapped, and I know of the hostage, and I know that I support this movement. It gives me strength to continue to support it. It has a lot of benefits. Does it influence, and will it influence if there's more people? If it's not 100,000, it's 200 or 500,000. That makes a difference for this government? I'm not sure, honestly. I think we have a problem with the mechanism. How does it go from street protest to changing the government's policy? I don't think we've cracked it yet, honestly. I think it's just it makes the government operates in different ways. It helps us in the world, but I'm not sure it's going to lead to what we want, and that's a different question. And I have to say, I'm thinking more in the direction of shvita, strike of the economic sectors. There's other ways to maybe move the pendulum to where we want it to go.
I hear that, and I kind of do agree here, though, that the numbers make a difference. And if you do have such a large portion of the people on the street, it is something that the Bibi will not be able to as easily ignore and write off. And I think that tragically, part of the failure of the hostage forum has been not being able to turn this into a mass Israeli event that more people are coming out. For example, lots of people from the religious Zionist sector, the Haredi sector, are not demonstrating and protesting on behalf of the hostages. And that, I don't want to say that that's the reason that they're still languishing inside Gaza and tunnels, and now we know also in apartments. But I think that might be something that has to do with it, and is one of the reasons why the government is not rushing to make a deal. But on that point, I do want to ask the both of you before we wrap up, what is the plan as you see it at the moment? Or do you think there isn't one? Because on the one hand, I think we have to recognize the fact that Rafah, which Israel had turned into like the Alamo with its, big talk about what Rafah was going to be and building up towards it with great anticipation, things have overall, there's been obviously the tragedy over the weekend with 8 soldiers killed in an armored personnel carrier that went over an explosive device. And we have other casualties as well. But overall, the operation in Rafah has been going quite well from an IDF perspective. They've taken over the Philadelphia corridor. They've been able to eliminate hundreds of Hamas terrorists, according to the IDF, destroy a lot of infrastructure. But that's going to come to an end at some point. That might be a week, it might be 2, maybe they'll drag it out to 3. But you're already starting to hear from people in the army that we're ready to call it a day, right? But we need something to end with. And we don't have that. And I had thought that maybe the deal that had been put on the table by President Biden was what was going to be the end mechanism. Finish up Rafah. Bibi could say, I got my complete victory. Here is now the deal to get back the hostages. That doesn't seem to be happening. What is our plan? So Shmuel, give me your 2-minute plan, and then Michal, your 2-minute plan.
Well, I the government, I see any signs that they have such time. And what I see is a day-by-day mechanism of decision-making. I don't see a clear vision for Gaza. I think what is truly happening is that we are being dragged into a prolonged conflict over Gaza, in which we will have to go back and forth, getting in, getting out, finding some local agencies or international agencies to provide food and shelter. And this will go on for some time. I don't think Hamas is ready to make a deal. We entertained such thoughts or hopes for too long. And it's time to admit that Hamas feels strong enough not to sign a deal. They feel that they can come out of this conflict not losing. That's all they need. Not to lose. They don't need to win.
All they need is to just simply survive.
To hang in there. And I don't think Israel currently has a clear plan for how to replace Hamas with a different entity or a different force. And until it does, Israel will have to be in charge, which means we are going to need the forces there coming in and out. We are going to have reserves. We will have an ongoing problem in the north, because you can't imagine the north quieting down before you end the war in the south. It's a tough situation, and again, if there is I hope there is a plan. If there is a plan, they keep it under wraps. I don't see it.
Michal?
I think there were a few assumptions made in your, question that I think are simply not, valid. I think you think that Bibi wants a deal. For the hostage. I think he's given up on that. We have enough evidence at this point to suggest that he doesn't. I think that has to do with who votes for him and who sits in the government with him. And he's fine with that, and he's okay with, a few heroic attempts to secure a few hostages, and that's enough for him. He's given up on that, and I think we've have enough testimony of that, and we saw that. So I think that's not a win for him. I think the fact that you assume he wants the war to end because it's been dwindling down. We had a period before when dwindling down. He can't say the war is over, and because he doesn't have a win, and the situation is awful for him. I think it can last for months ahead. And that's good for him, because we just talked about one of the ramifications. People don't go out in the street in the middle of the war to protest. So that's good for, there's a lot of benefits to saying that the war keeps going. Obviously, there's horrible ramification. We're paying, and we lost the support of the world in such a short time because the war keeps going on, even though we don't get any benefits from him. But there are benefits to Bibi, to continuing the war. So he doesn't want the war to end. So there's so many assumptions in your question that what we all want is what Bibi wants, which I don't think is true anymore. And I think, and I think that's what's awful. And I want to just say one more thing. I think the loss of trust in our government to do what's right, or to have the foresight to even make a decision already. You want to go full war? Go full war. You want to go full, deal, go full. something. There's a sense of like, weeding in water and just letting things fall apart and without any decision and no one, there isn't the Shmuel, I was surprised to hear that you think that there might be a possibility of a plan somewhere. I don't know where you get that, burst of optimism. I
said,
don't.
I hope there is I don't do
saw this
psychoanalysis of the
optimism.
prime minister.
No, honestly,
Yeah, I don't analyze the wants of the prime minister. I don't know what he wants and why. I can only judge what I can see, and I don't see a plan.
Yeah.
Very
Well,
depressing.
We will try to end with some hope, because hope is what keeps us going to at least to get to the next episode, which we will have. But I want to thank you both, Michal and Shmuel. And now for the interview that I did with a senior paramedic and international relations liaison with Magen David Adom, Aryeh Myers. Very interesting. Have a watch. Aryeh Myers, great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
So as one of the more senior paramedics, and you work in Magen David Adom and MADA in the international relations department, and very much one of the forward-facing people for Magen David Adom toward the world, and definitely to the English-speaking part of the world. There's a lot of talk right now, obviously in Israel, of the challenges that we might face if, God forbid, there's going to be another second front to this war. All eyes are, of course, in the north. What's going to happen with Hezbollah in Lebanon? Lots of rockets. And I don't expect you to have the inside scoop on whether there's going to be a war or not going to be a war. Obviously, very complicated question. I just happened to, the other night, meet with a group of congressmen who were visiting here, and also tried to explain to them just the dilemma of whether it's the right thing for Israel, it's not the right thing for Israel. So you and I can each have our opinion, but I'm more curious, and the reason I wanted to talk to you is because obviously we've had a lot of challenges since October 7th and on October 7th, and we'll talk about that in a moment, because I want you to tell us a bit about what happened and how MADA adapted on October 7th. But before that, when we think about the second front and the second possibility and a bigger war against a bigger enemy, what does that mean for emergency services at large in this country? And specifically, what would it mean for a place like Magen David Adom?
So first of all, as emergency services anywhere around the world, we always have to be prepared for what might happen. What does that mean? It could mean a whole range of things. It means that what happens if we're not even talking about a war situation, we're talking about our routine emergencies. What happens if I have 3 calls in the same area of the same severity? How do I deal with it as an organization? How do I know that I've got enough ambulances, that I know that I've got the right response? And that burden falls on Magen David Adom in Israel as Israel's national EMS organization. We play multiple roles in the state of Israel. One is obviously the ambulance service, or the EMS, the emergency medical services. And the other is the blood services. Those are the 2 major roles, especially, that will come into effect when we talk about a possible war in the north. And if we do go back very briefly to October 7th, our main concern in the first few minutes of the war as an organization was that, okay, we've got all of this rocket fire coming in from the south, mainly into the south, certainly in the first half an hour or so of the war. But our big fear was, what happens if this develops and Hezbollah in the north also comes into play? What happens if in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, if that comes into play as well? And we as an organization need to be prepared for all of those eventualities on a national scale. And that's having the right number of ambulances. It means preparing our teams for mass casualty situations. And whilst we do that on a regular basis, and we're doing that pre-October 7th as well, we're now doing it in perhaps a different way, and certainly with an eye on the past to have an eye on the future. So we now know, when we talk about mass casualties, we were talking about things like train crashes. We were talking about like mass incidents and incidents that we saw in the early 2000s in Jerusalem, for example, where
Like
bus bombs, things such like, right, terrorist attacks. We obviously weren't expecting anything on the scale of October 7th. Nevertheless, because of the way the organization is prepared, is always planning ahead, we were able to respond in a way that meant that thousands of lives were saved as an organization. And now we need to be prepared for that in the north as well.
So, one of the one of the things, and we'll talk about this in a moment, that Magen David Adom obviously went out on a fundraising campaign, and basically to purchase lots of new ambulances, lots of new vehicles and equipment to deal with the shortage or the shortfall that existed, and after October 7th. But when you look, like for example, the Army, when they think about war, right? So they look at, okay, how many bombs do we have? How many aircraft do we have? How many F-16s can we allocate to the north? How many F-16s can we allocate to the south? How many soldiers? I mean, you gotta look at the vehicles, right? At what number of soldiers you have. Now, I'm curious, like, we still have this high intensity battle taking place down south. Now, yes, it's mostly in Gaza. And I'm guessing that Magen David Adom's role there might be at the most for the time being. You're not inside Gaza, right? You're not the army, but it's meeting maybe the wounded at the border, transporting them to hospital if needed, although the army also does that. So we're not at that mass casualty event anymore. But if this happens in the north, like, do we currently have enough ambulances and medical emergency EMS emergency services for the north and the south at the same time?
So what normally happens in Magen David Adom is a normal shift. Our busiest shift, we normally have between 350 and 450 ambulances on shift. That's out of a fleet today of about 1,600 ambulances.
Across the country.
Across the country, we've got, again, as the nationally mandated EMS organization, we've got 200 stations across the country, these 1,600 ambulances, another 1,200 or so emergency vehicles of all types, whether that's helicopters, boats, medicycles, or motorbikes, all sorts of different response vehicles. We've got a fleet that is a very big fleet. We are still looking to increase it. Again, looking to the future, not necessarily just from a war point of view, but obviously that is the top of the headlines at the moment, but also from the point of view that I can tell you, when I moved to Israel 12 years ago, and the population in Israel 12 years ago was about 7.5 million. We're now approaching 10 million. So we've got to look at that point of view as well. The demographic is changing, it's growing. It means that we have to be able to provide a wider service. And that means, yes, increasing the fleet of vehicles we have. It means increasing the number of volunteers we have. At the moment, 90% of our workforce are volunteers, well over 30,000 volunteers. And whether we're volunteers, whether it's employed staff, everybody is trained to the same level. So an EMT, whether he's a volunteer or an employee, is trained to the same level. Same with the paramedics, which is important because when a team turns up for whatever the call is, right, we're wearing the same uniform and nobody knows, right? Our patient, the casualty won't know whether someone is a volunteer, whether someone is employed staff. And I think that's part of being nationally prepared. We want to make sure that if I end up going, like I did on October 7th, if I end up going into the war zone, which might not be the area where I normally work, I need to know that all the protocols are the same, that the ambulances are the same, the equipment is the same, that everything, again, is on a national scale, and I can respond wherever I'm needed. And that, again, proved itself very much in the first days of the war. And it's something that we're planning for the future. I mean, part of that plan includes now drills that we haven't necessarily done in the past, in Hebrew, Tochnit Alata. So we're planning of what happens if all the electricity goes down, which is one of the scenarios that everybody's been talking about. And there've been drills across the country, across Magen David Adom in different regions. What happens if the electricity goes down, if our communication system goes down? We were always working on sort of backup to the backup to the backup. That's the way we work, whether that's on the front line with the EMS, whether that's with the blood services. Again, we provide 98% of the blood supplies to the hospitals, 100% of the blood supplies to the IDF. We need to make sure that is available, come what may. We need to make sure that we have the volunteers who are willing to come and join Magen David Adom. That's not something we usually struggle with. We're obviously always looking to increase the number of volunteers and staff involved. And we're doing that in order to make sure that, again, we can be prepared for whatever happens, whatever response is required.
One of the things you told me in the past was about the blood bank, the new blood bank underground, right, which actually just opened right before October 7th. Tell us a bit about that. What is that new facility? And what was it like? Because I remember in the beginning of when the war broke out after the Hamas attack, I mean, people were lining up, right, to go give blood. And at some point you had to tell people, slow down, guys.
Right. So the new blood bank that like you say, it just opened. It was a work in progress from plan started back at the early 2010s. So I think 2011 they started planning. 2017 they started building this new facility, and again it was built for several reasons. One is because the old facility in Tel Hashomer Hospital, we've outgrown it again because the demographics of the country mainly, and that was problem number one. Problem number two is that when it was built back in the 80s, we weren't worried about rockets landing in central Israel. It wasn't something that we were concerned about, and therefore this was built without any protection. The new place that has been built in Rosner is built where all the labs, all of the storage facilities are all built underground, different levels, down to about 60 feet underground, protected against conventional weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, earthquakes, because we've got to take them into consideration as well in this part of the world. And the place was supposed to open for full operations on the 9th of October. Everything was ready and up and running, and we were kind of ready for what they call in Israel Aryeh Myers. So once the festivals are over, we'll move everything in, right? So all the machinery had been moved in, everything had been validated. It was a process that took a couple of years from the official dedication of the building, and then we moved in very, very quickly. Obviously, as soon as the war started, to enable the huge amount of blood donations that did come flooding in the first few days of the war. On a regular day, we collect about 1,000 units. On day one of the war, we collected 2,500 units. That went up to 4,000, 5,000 in the following days as well. And like you say, Israelis who are not known for wanting to stand in lines for too long, stood waiting for 6 and 8 and 10 hours in the first few days to come and give blood, to make sure that there were blood supplies for the hospitals and for the IDF. And the main reason we actually told people to stop coming wasn't the fact that we couldn't necessarily deal with the influx, but we wanted to make sure that in the coming weeks that we had other people who were able to come and donate blood. You can only come and give blood once every 3 months or so. The blood supplies you can only keep for about 6 weeks. So we didn't want to reach a point where everybody who could donate, who wanted to donate, donated in the first week, and then we wouldn't have people to come and donate further along down the line. So we had to plan that as well. We initially encouraged people with type O blood, because that's blood that's kind of a universal donor, so we can give it to anyone. And so they were the people that we encouraged in the first few days to come and give. But again, it was an amazing thing to see. It was a real show of I guess a show of unity, because a lot of the people who came to donate in those first few days of the war were first-time donors, and they were driven to come and help the state of Israel in whatever way they could. And if they weren't going to go and join the reserves, and they couldn't work necessarily in the medical field, whatever it was, they wanted to come and help Magen Adom to help the state of Israel with those blood supplies.
So, I mean, just so people, I think, fully understand, we're a country, yes, that has grown now, as you mentioned earlier, to 10 million people, but we're still geographically, we're a pretty small country. And this is the one blood bank, right? So all blood, whether it's collected wherever, comes to this facility, and from there it's distributed around the country. Is that how it works?
So most of the blood comes into this one facility. Again, we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. We always want to have a backup plan to whatever it is. So there is a second blood bank up in Haifa, and the old facility in Tel Hashomer Hospital, we're still using it for certain purposes as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the vast majority of the blood supplies, the blood donations that come in through the blood bank in Rosner, and are processed there and then shipped from there to wherever they're required, whether that's the hospitals, whether that's the IDF, whether that's the rescue teams, wherever they're needed.
So something else you had told me about the blood itself that's been provided to the IDF is a different type of blood form. I never did biology, so sorry for sounding like a total idiot.
So normally what happens with a blood donation is the blood unit is normally separated into 3 different components: into plasma, into platelets, and into red blood cells, used for different purposes. We're not going to go into the biology of it now. Used for different purposes. But what's been happening over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of research, especially in trauma scenarios, of providing whole blood rather than just the red blood cells, is to make sure that casualties are receiving whole blood, so that it isn't separated into the components. They're receiving it as a whole unit, and they're also receiving it on the front line. Something that has changed over the last few years used to be that an injured soldier would receive fluids soon after being injured until they were evacuated away from the front line, and then they would receive blood. So there was a delay of minutes to hours between the injury and receiving blood units, and they were just receiving what is effectively salty water until they could get that blood. And what's happening now is that the IDF units have doctors and paramedics in the units who are able to give blood units at the scene. So as soon as a soldier has been injured, within a very, very short space of time, they're already receiving a blood transfusion.
And this is
And
because
that's
they're
shown-
losing blood, so this way they get blood? Is that the...
Exactly. So they're receiving back everything that they've lost, if they and to do it as quickly as we possibly can. That, along with the rapid evacuations to hospital, has done wonders for mortality rates. So in previous wars, not just Israel's wars, but we're looking at around the world, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, looking at statistics there where the mortality rates were around between 15 and 20%. The mortality rates in this war have been less than 7%, which is
of the soldiers
amazing
wounded,
statistic.
we're talking.
Of soldiers wounded, the mortality rates was up to 20% of those wounded were dying of their injuries.
Yeah.
And most of that is due to blood loss. So the fact that we can now replace that blood much quicker on the front line is saving lives.
Yeah. Sadly, we're talking just after, a very rough day when 11 soldiers were killed in different incidents, but the 8 of them in an armored personnel carrier, that wasn't blood loss, unfortunately, what they died of. That was a tragic explosion of an underground explosive device that just blew up the armored personnel carrier. Aryeh, so when Magen David Adom, let's jump back in time for a moment to October 7th, right? There were medics who were on the ground, obviously in the kibbutzim, people who lived there, right? Yeah, some of your medics were killed in the kibbutzim, servicing and treating wounded, but also lots of you were scrambled down to the south. Just walk us through for a moment what was that like that day?
So, like most people across the country, woken up at 6:30 in the morning by red alert sirens. Again, what part of my role is dealing, speaking to the media, is social media, is telling the story of Magen David Adom and of the state of Israel. So I started receiving messages very, very early on. And one of the first steps that were taken by Magen David Adom was within 15 minutes of the first rockets being fired, we went to what's known as full manning. So an order went out from the Director General to say, even though we've got 350 ambulances on shift at the moment, I want every single emergency vehicle manned, something that happened within the hour. So all 1,400, at the time we had 1,400 ambulances, all the medicycles, the helicopters, the boats, everything was manned within the first hour of the war to make sure that we had the capability to respond again to whatever might come our way. Now, we couldn't send all 1,400 ambulances down to the south because, again, A, we've got the routine emergencies, and B, we're worried about what might develop, whether that's in the north, whether that's in Judea and Samaria, wherever it is. So we need to make sure that we have teams available everywhere. And a lot of that is, again, thanks to the fact that we have this huge volunteer force who, as soon as we say that we need this assistance, everybody was in. Because the war started at 6:30 in the morning, it was just before changeover time. So the night shift normally finishes at 7, the day shift comes in at 7. So the night shift stayed on, the day shift was already on the way in. We doubled our numbers very, very quickly. And then people came in from wherever it was required. We sent bulletproof ambulances from the Jerusalem region, from the Judea and Samaria region. We sent about half of our fleet of bulletproof ambulances. That sounds like a huge number when you say half a fleet, but we're talking about less than a dozen bulletproof ambulances down to the south. And they were able to reach areas that we couldn't necessarily send regular ambulances or intensive care units. But again, if we go back to these volunteers and the staff, the fact we've got this huge force means that we are everywhere, right? We have volunteers on kibbutzim and on yeshuvim, and they're the ambulance drivers, and then the paramedics, and they are the EMTs for those yeshuvim, for the areas. They will come and volunteer on a regular shift, but they'll also be there responding all the time. So wherever I am at any given moment, my phone is on me. The GPS technology will locate exactly where I am, and if there is a call nearby, I'll get that call, whether I belong to that region or not. And that was the same in the south. The first reports we started receiving were from our volunteers on the kibbutzim saying, we're seeing these gliders coming in with terrorists on board. We're seeing terrorists in the streets with semi-automatic weapons. We understood what was going on very, very quickly, thanks to the fact that we were getting reports both from our staff and volunteers and also from the general public. So the general public can't call the IDF and say, this is what's happening on the street. They can call Magen David Adom because that's what we're there for. We are an emergency number. So they were calling us, A, because there were casualties, and B, because we're a national emergency service, and they know that we will be there to respond to whatever needs responding. The areas that we couldn't necessarily reach, we set up rendezvous points on Yishuvim, in ambulance stations, at major junctions across the south, where we had teams that were responding either from those points, or we were collecting casualties from wherever they were to bring them to these rendezvous points and then evacuating them to the nearby hospitals. The two major hospitals in the south, Soroka in Beersheba and Barzilai in Ashkelon, very quickly became overwhelmed with the number of casualties. So we were helping them do secondary transfers to hospitals outside of that region, up to Jerusalem, to central Israel, and making sure that we had teams that were responding all the time. I went down to the south a little bit later on in the day. We came under rocket fire on a number of occasions whilst we were evacuating patients whose homes had been hit or had been affected in the streets. And this was ongoing for the first 36 hours that we had teams that were coming under direct fire. And whilst we thought initially, we hadn't really realized that we were the target of these Hamas plans. We only found that out a couple of days later when plans were found on Hamas terrorists, directing them to the ambulance station in Sderot, that they had information where our ambulances were kept on the kibbutzim, in all the communities in the area. In certain cases, they knew exactly where the ambulance drivers lived in those communities. And they were directly targeted. One of our ambulance EMTs was on his way to the Nova Music Festival very early on, about 7 a.m. And he was shot in the ambulance and killed on his way there. One of our paramedics on Kibbutz Be'eri, Amit Man, was shot and killed in the clinic, having spent hours treating casualties until the terrorists eventually broke into the clinic, and she was killed there along with a number of other people. 5 members of our staff were killed in the first 24 hours whilst providing life-saving aid to those around them in the areas where they were. And several were injured. 14 of our ambulances were destroyed. And again, it's the first time that Magen David Adom as an organization has come under direct attack. The fact that we had these bulletproof ambulances 100% saved lives.
And let's just say, as people should know, attacking an ambulance is a war crime. But
absolutely right. So yeah, when we hear people talking about war crimes, one of the war crimes they don't mention is the fact that medical staff, medical vehicles, medical facilities were all attacked, and they weren't attacked, for want of a better way of putting it, by accident. These were planned attacks directly at Magen David Adom, directly trying to prevent us from providing the aid that was required to all of these casualties in the south of Israel and further away as well. Luckily, our teams didn't come under attack in sort of central Israel, but again, there were rocket attacks into Tel Aviv, into Rishon LeZion, into Jerusalem, and people were injured in all these areas as well. And you have to take into account that there are still daily rocket attacks. Whether that's from the south, whether that's from the north. Yesterday was, I think, the first day since October 7th. There was no actual red alert siren in the north of Israel. What that means, I don't know. But our teams are still dealing with casualties of rocket attacks, whether they're these drones, whether they are mortar fire, whatever it is, from whichever area it happens to be coming from. And this is again following on from what happened on October 7th, B, what happened in mid-April with the Iranian attack, where again we had every single vehicle was fully manned, and the way that turned out was obviously an amazing result for us, despite the fact that there was one serious casualty, but one serious casualty of 350 missiles. I think we can be grateful that was the result. But obviously we were there and prepared for something much, much, much larger than that.
Right. Well, Aryeh Myers, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for everything you do and providing your emergency services and treatment on behalf of Magen David Adom to the Israeli people. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.